Hey everybody, it's Jason with Parallel Reality coming back with you here today with an article from the Federalist dated January 18th, and it's entitled, I Wonder Why Leftists Leave Comanche Imperialism Out of Their Performative Land Acknowledgments. Yeah, and you hear from, I thought this would be interesting because you hear from people on the left all the time about the colonizers and they took our land and they seem to think that like Indians or, Native Americans were just living here in North America, like in a state of kumbaya, like peacefulness with everybody else. And it's like, you guys don't know what was going on here, do you? And so I thought this would be an interesting thing to go over. So let's just dive right in. So the story of the Comanches in the Red River War, whose 150th anniversary we marked this year, shows the absurdity of the noble savage narrative. This Davos 2024, the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, began this week in Davos, Switzerland. This year's event, WF explains, marks the launch of the Indigenous Peoples Knowledge and Leadership Network as Indigenous leaders from across the globe attend the forum to share their unique perspectives, given they steward one-third of the Earth's territories, continuing cultural and spiritual practices that nurture their environments and communities. It's true, as far as it goes, that Indigenous peoples around the world often have valuable insights into the ecology of their homes. Of course they do. It says, yet the Davos event also plays into a confused narrative that dominates contemporary understanding of modernity's interactions with indigenous groups, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. In this narrative, native peoples, prior to European settlement, lived in a harmonious, symbiotic relationship with nature. All, we are told in countless textbooks, television programs, and movies, was perfectly peaceful and happy until the white man arrived. Yet one need only consider the story of the Comanches in the Red River War, whose 150th anniversary we mark this year, to see the absurdity of the noble savage narrative. There's little known today, the Red River War, which I've heard of, but I don't really know anything about, so hopefully we'll find out something about it here. So the Red River War defeated the most powerful Indian tribe in American history, the Comanche, whose history is as remarkable as it is chilling. Though the Comanche are usually associated with parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and New Mexico, they had migrated there from farther north in what is now Wyoming. Originally hunter gatherers, the introduction of the horse by the Spanish in the 17th century revolutionized the Comanche way of life. They were soon some of the best horsemen in the world and began an impressive military campaign into what became their new homeland. In the process, they did this word here that I'm not going to say because YouTube is not a freedom of speech place. So they did that, slaughtered and displaced earlier inhabitants such as the Apache and Pueblo. The Spanish, who attempted some settlements into Comanche territory, were so frustrated and humiliated by the tribe, one catastrophe in 1758 resulted in the execution and mutilation of several priests, that they largely gave up and eventually signed a treaty of sorts with the Comanche in 1779. The new nation of Mexico invited Anglo-Americans to settle in Texas, in part to create a buffer between Mexico and the restive Comanche tribes, who regularly raided deep into Mexican territory. And it was when Texans got involved that things got bloody. Go Texas. It says, obviously, the Comanche viewed Anglo-American settlement in their traditional hunting grounds as a threat, though it was also an opportunity, given that European settlers brought horses and other prizes. Thus began decades of brutally violent raids into Texan and later American territory. And the classic Comanche way of fighting, detailed in S.C. Gwynn's best-selling book Empire of the Summer Moon, which I've never heard of, maybe you want to check that out, says was a surprise attack on civilian targets. Men would be killed and their bodies mutilated almost beyond recognition. Women were, as you can see, this term right here that once again I'm not going to say, says that either killed or abducted to be held for ransom. Young children were also abducted, either for ransom or to be incorporated into the tribe, as happened with the famous case of Cynthia Ann Parker. Really? Okay. I just wanted to see if this was like a link to something. Okay, maybe I'll have to check that out too. Says babies viewed as too much of a hassle for migratory horsemen were typically wounded. So, yeah, right there. Not a bunch of people that you'd really want to, it kind of does obliterate the whole noble savage thing. Says the Comanche would never peacefully coexist. Says Texan and later federal attempts to stop Comanche raids for years were typically ill-conceived and ineffective, as the Indians were far better horsemen, knew the territory better, and had tactical superiority with their fast-firing bows and arrows against single-shot rifles and pistols. Sometimes Rangers and federal troops would stumble upon a Comanche village, usually resulting in punitive violence against mostly defenseless indigenous men, women, and children. The Civil War in turn emptied Texas of many of its fighting men, and once the Comanche realized this, they were able for a time to considerably push back the Texas frontier. Yet the settlers, buffalo hunters, and cowboys kept coming, eventually leading some Comanche to make terms. So it says then in the summer of 1874, about 250 Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors under the command of Quanah Parker, who ironically enough was the half Comanche son of Cynthia Ann Parker. Oh, interesting. Okay, that's like kind of connecting already. Was determined to launch a brutal revenge campaign against Anglo-American settlements. Though their first target, a group of buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls, was a failure, they then swept the southern plains, massacring almost 200 white men, women, and children. In response, President Ulysses S. Grant in July gave Commanding General of the United States Army William T. Sherman permission to put all agencies and reservations under military control in an attempt to finally bring the Comanche and their allies to heel. So that was in 1874. Okay, I didn't know Sherman was still basically that much in charge of everything. I guess your march to the sea in Atlanta in the South really put you in charge of stuff there, huh? Don't really know much about Sherman's life, so okay, interesting. So this is relying on the expertise of Renaud Slidell Mackenzie, a career U.S. Army officer who had been fighting the Comanche for years. 5 mounted columns of federal soldiers set out from various forts across the West to defeat the last remnants of the Comanche Nation. By that time, likely little more than 1,000 Comanche were roaming the plains. There were a few major engagements in the Red River War, most of the campaign featuring small actions as federal troops and Indians played a huge game of hide and seek across the wilderness. One such battle, in which fewer than 10 people died, Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry discovered the main Comanche camp in a remote canyon, drove them off, and captured more than 1,000 horses. He ordered most of the horses to be shot. Well, why? It says it was the loss. Oh, because of the Comanche thing. Okay, this is the loss of the Comanche's horses, the backbone of their nomadic way of life, more than anything else, that persuaded the last holdouts of the great tribe to surrender and accept life on the reservations. Okay, so that's why they killed the horses, was just so the Comanche wouldn't have them. Because first I'm like, wait, why would you just do that? Like, wouldn't they need them too? I guess they couldn't really do much with 1,000 horses though. Like, how are you supposed to wrangle all that and get it back to where you need it to get, where we need all of them to go? Anyway, it says what about the Comanche Wars teach us about today? The half century of conflict between the Anglo American settlers and the Comanche Nation was, of course, brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. We should mourn the Comanches' forced removal to several reservations, where a proud people lost their way of life and were horribly mistreated and exploited by conniving businessmen and federal employees. Witnessing the avaricious destructiveness of the buffalo hunters, who cleared the plains of literally millions of buffalo in a single decade, was undoubtedly traumatic for the Comanche. Yeah, really. It says, yet the Comanche, many years before they ever crossed paths with the Spanish or Anglo Americans, were far from innocent victims. Like so many powerful mounted peoples that roamed the Eurasian steppes, they built their empire through violence and terror. For several decades of the 19th century, Americans got a taste of that Comanche way of life, and what they witnessed was deeply disturbing, a kingdom built upon the constant cruel violation of human dignity. There could be no modus vivendi between a culture of migratory horsemen and another of sedentary settlers. The former required communities sufficiently vulnerable to raid, the latter would always seek more land for farming and grazing. As the story of the Comanche in America is a sad one, but it is difficult to imagine it playing out differently, largely because of qualities too deeply ingrained in the two adversarial cultures. But it is also a story that defies contemporary stereotypes of innocent, victimized indigenous peoples and rapacious colonizing whites. The Comanche were just as much imperialists as the Europeans ever were. Though Europeans could certainly be violently cruel, unfortunately censured violence against civilians. Indeed, when stories of federal troops massacring defenseless Indians traveled east, the American people were horrified. The same cannot be said of the Comanche, whose brutality was an indelible component of their cultural identity. It's true as much today as it was 150 years ago that the West can learn from indigenous peoples such as the Comanche, who are not only tremendous horsemen and students of the natural world, but incredibly resourceful in finding a use for practically every part of the buffalo, which, with the horse, served as a cornerstone of their society. That doesn't mean we should embrace a simplistic, starry eyed conception of native peoples or a benighted, self hating understanding of our own civilization. Indeed, I'd imagine Davos man, comfortably enjoying the benefits of modern Switzerland, would much prefer the safety and stability of today's West to the callous, capricious viciousness of the pre-modern Comanche, unless perhaps he's aiming to play the role of the Comanche. So, yeah, that did answer some questions. It's a pretty general article. Something I'd be definitely more interested in hearing about is just this sort of thing, just from a historical perspective. It didn't really go into the Red River War at all, besides saying basically some people died and horses were killed. But yeah, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, that there's just this myth about the Native Americans being like, again, like it said here, just in a kumbaya state of just peacefulness with nature, and that's just not the case. The Comanche, I know it's just one tribe here, but this wasn't. They were seen as the most ruthless, I guess, but there were many others that did fairly similar things, and especially to each other. So it wasn't just the white man; they did it to each other well before the white man came. So just thought I'd put that to rest. So, what do you guys think about this? If you know more about this than I do, by all means, link me to some, things I can read to learn more about this. Just be again from a historical perspective. So, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.